I also want to make a point of saying we are very thrilled to be able to work with the Office of Cultural Affairs. And this webinar is really made possible with support from the Foundation from Healthy St. Pete and working in conjunction with Grow Smarter. We want to reach out to everyone in our community as best we can so that our arts economic development is developed equitably. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Barbara and let her begin with Grant Writing 101. If you have questions, you can write them or in the chat. I will monitor those, and when I see them, I will raise my hand and ask Barbara to address them. Thanks for joining us. Barbara, it's all yours.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm coming to you from my dining room right now, which I share with two lovely coworkers, being my children. So hopefully they will not be making appearances during this webinar. So I'm so glad that you're all here to hear my presentation about grant writing. Some of the people who are here today have heard a similar presentation before, but hopefully you will be able to get something new out of it because I do try to keep it updated and current. So let's get started. So I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I am currently the Chief Development Officer for the Florida Orchestra, and I am managing our grants at the current time, as well as overseeing all of our contributed revenue. But I've been writing grants for a long time. Actually, one of my very first jobs 20 years ago was funded by a grant, and so that was how I got started doing this in the first place. I've also worked for Studio 620, Ruth Eckerd Hall, and American Stage as far as local. And for 9 years, I worked for the Tessitura Network, which is a consulting and technology company that serves arts and culture. And I worked with them in a variety of capacities, including as a development consultant, which is also how I got to the orchestra. For 6 or so years, I chaired the Arts Advisory Committee for the City of St. Pete, and so I read a lot of grants. What that committee does is reads all of the grants that all of you submit in order to get city funding and scores them in a grant panel that's done every year. So that was where I did a bulk of my grant reading, and I also sit on panels for the state of Florida as well. This year, I will be doing the one for regional theater, and I have served as well on panels for presenters. Also, just a little about me personally, I am normally a world traveler, although not right now. I am a musician myself, also a big advocate for the arts, and I am mom to my current office mates that are in here with me right now. All right, this is the agenda that we're going to be going over today. This agenda is going to be following us throughout the presentation, so you can kind of see a roadmap of where we are and where we're going. First, we're going to start with an overview. So the purpose of today's presentation is to talk about grant writing. So what is a grant? So basically, a grant is money for a purpose. And typically, grants are given out by foundations or government agencies. Those can be family foundations, private foundations, corporate foundations, or some sort of government agency such as the City of St. Petersburg, for example, State of Florida, and so on and so forth. Typically, grants are written for specific projects. Less and less am I seeing grants that's for general support. There aren't a lot of those kinds of opportunities anymore. Typically, if you want to catch the attention of a foundation, it has to be for a project that somehow meets their own funding needs and their own funding goals, and how you can demonstrate how you can meet the things that that foundation wants to accomplish. Normally, getting a grant involves some sort of proposal process. They are all somewhat similar, which is what we're going to go through today. Sometimes writing a grant is just going to be a simple letter, just a letter of inquiry that gives an overview of what you're wanting to accomplish. Sometimes they are humongous packets that can take you a ton of time. The amount of money that you get does not necessarily line up with how complicated the grant is. I've spent upwards of 80 hours on a grant for about $5,000, and I've also very quickly rattled off one letter for a grant that got us more than $30,000. So regardless, a process is what a process is, and that's what we're going to talk about today. This is a very typical grant cycle. They're all a little different, but this kind of gives you an idea of what a typical grant cycle looks like. And I'm going to be going through the various steps in this grant cycle, but this sort of just gives you an overview to help frame this exercise about how grants are put together. So a grant is an opportunity for you to talk about your organization, your programming, your mission, what you want to accomplish in the community. It's a chance to tell your story, and you want that story to be as compelling as possible, so then people who are reading your grant truly understand what you do in this community in order to make the place great, and hopefully inspire them to give you the money to make that happen. So where do we start? We're going to start with a funding statement. So I'm going to walk you through the way that I typically approach grant writing at the beginning of a year or beginning of a cycle. And the first thing that I always do is develop a funding statement. So just for some perspective, when I pulled these numbers, there were more than 1.5 million nonprofits registered in the United States. That's a lot. There are thousands and thousands in Pinellas County alone. And unfortunately, we are all competing for the same funding. There is limited grant funding. There is an abundance of grant needs. And so you have to make sure that when you define the need for your organization, you are telling a compelling story, because there is going to be plenty of competition to get those dollars. So let's dig into what makes your organization special. What is your purpose? Grants are going to provide the dollars that you need in order to support the mission. But in order to get that money, you're going to have to make other people aware of your need, and you're going to have to inspire them to support whatever kind of plan that you have. So with that, we're going to develop a funding statement. This is kind of square one. This is probably some of the work that you did when your organization even started. But if you haven't explored this in a while, writing grants is a good time to do that. So what is in your funding statement? Number one, why is your work important, meaningful, and necessary? Not just what do you do, but why is your work important? A lot of times I use the example, Opera Philadelphia did a great branding exercise a couple of years ago where they wanted to get across the message that opera makes you feel alive. It's important, it's vital. It's something that we have to have in this community in order to make this a great place to live. So think now about, why is your work critical? Why is it important? Why is it meaningful? And why is it necessary? Secondly, why are you, your organization, why are you uniquely qualified to fulfill these needs? Can just anyone fulfill these needs, or are you in your organization the one who is going to be able to fulfill the need that you set out to fulfill? Also, what kind of impact and outcome are you hoping to achieve with your organization and with your programming? Next, we need to get into details. What's the plan? What's the timeline? How much money do you need? How are you going to cover those costs? And what evaluation methods are you going to have in place? What funding sources are available? You don't want to be funded by just one grant, and a foundation isn't going to want to be your only funder. They're going to want to know that you have other funding sources in addition to what you are asking for at that moment. Also, super bonus brownie points if you can include long-range plans for your organization. No one wants to think that they are just giving you money to fulfill one little tiny need. They don't want to just fill a hole just for the hole to open up and get even bigger after that. What are your long-range plans? Where are you headed? How is this going to be sustainable? How are you going to continue this moving on and on so then they know that their investment is worthwhile? So, what should be in your funding statement? I'll tell you. First off, what is your vision? What are the values that inform your work? If your efforts were entirely successful, what would the world look like if you reached everything that you had in your potential? Now, I will tell you that a long time ago, when I started writing grants about 20 years ago, it was pretty typical to have to answer this question for what is your vision. I'm seeing this less and less as a requirement in a grant application, but just as part of your funding statement, as part of your framing exercise, I think it is a worthwhile exercise to think about what is your vision. What do you want to accomplish? Next, so important, is your mission. I have yet to ever see a grant application that didn't ask for your mission. If someone would like to prove me wrong, please do. But up until now, I have never seen a nonprofit organization not have to supply their mission when applying for a grant. What is your purpose? For whose benefit does your organization exist? A mission statement should be concise and direct. If it's more than 3 sentences, it's too long. Now, you can't change your mission statement in order to meet the requirement in a grant application. If your mission statement does not accurately reflect your organization, it's time to revisit that with your board. The time to revisit that is not 3 hours before a grant application is due. The time to do that is when you can have some time and brain space to dedicate towards really exploring this mission. Now, I will tell you, a lot of grants, including the ones for the state of Florida, which I read, they will grade you based on your mission. You as the grant writer, there's probably not a lot you can do at that moment in order to change that mission statement. So be aware of that. Plan ahead. And if your mission statement no longer serves your organization or serves your needs, get that conversation started early before you start doing grant applications. Goals. What are your goals? What are your long-term broad statements that reflect your mission and guide your organizational planning? So goals are pretty large and they inform what is going to be happening in order to reach your mission. But specifically, the activities are the things that you're going to do in order to reach those goals. Importantly, when you're thinking about asking for money, is to be able to very narrowly define your needs. You're not going to just ask for money for nothing. It's not going to be broad. You're going to have to be very specific if you want to get people on board with what you're doing. So the first one is funding general operations. Now, as I mentioned, there are not a lot of grants anymore that fund general operations. I saw this maybe 15 years ago. Lately, not so much. What is more likely are going to be some of the things I'm getting into, including sustaining or expanding an existing project. So a lot of foundations, they want to know that they are sinking money into a winner. So an organization that has some sort of track record, has some sort of history of doing the kinds of things that you are asking money for, because they want to know that you can really do it. So sustain a project you've already started, expand something that you maybe have put out there and wanted to try. The next one down, new initiatives that serve specific needs. There is a foundation that I do an application for every year that just wants to see new initiatives. They want to know what's something different that you're doing that still meets your mission, but is a little bit outside of what you've already done. But bonus, they want to know that that funding is going to be sustainable after the first couple of years. So be sure that you're prepared to give that information. Some foundations will also fund infrastructure tools. I've seen grants that funded Wi-Fi for an office or some sort of capital need. So that is also an option if you have those kinds of infrastructure tools and needs, or the next bullet, capital projects. There are very specific grants that are for those needs. There's also great grants for staff training or professional development. This is a time when you could really invest in the staff that you have and get them some additional training or some professional development that's going to help your organization long term. All right, before I get into research, finding the right fit, which by the way is the #1 question that I always get asked when I do these workshops, I'm going to pause just for a moment to see, John, are there any questions that have come in about what we've talked about so far? And get some water. All right, John, you are muted. There you go.
Forgive me for being muted. No,
That's okay.
there are no questions. I was just typing back to a chat. Wayne's online too now.
Great. All right, good. Hi, Wayne.
So far, so good.
Hi. All right, great. Let's keep going. Let's talk about research because this is everyone's favorite question. So let's talk about that. Research, finding the right fit. This is important. Okay, so who's going to fund your project? Who are you going to apply to? How are you going to get money for what you want to accomplish? How are you going to find out what grants are available? The first one seems a little obvious, but I feel like I need to put it out there anyway, your current supporters. So the foundations, the government entities, the family foundations that are already supporting you, can they support you bigger? Do they have some other funding areas? Are there some other programs within their foundation that you could be applying for that you aren't already? I'll use an example, the Jesse Ball DuPont Fund. They have a number of funding streams available. And so if you are applying for one, that does not preclude you from applying for another. And so it might be worthwhile to see who are your current supporters and can you be getting more from them? Also, look through your donor files and see who past supporters were that have foundation written on the check, because that might be a good target, a good person for you to circle back to if there is some sort of funding available. Also, local foundations with an interest in your programming. check out and see who's funding everybody else. You know, if you're aware of another art gallery that got funding for such and such, perhaps your art gallery might be able to get funding for something too. We all do this. We all go to each other's organizations and read your donor walls. For any of you who are on today that have lists of donors, either in a playbill or on a wall, I promise you that I have read them, and we all do that. So look around, see who is doing the funding, and see if there is some sort of tie-in that you could have with an interest in your programming, or possibly even a partnership. Next, national foundations with a reputation for funding similar needs. In a little bit, I'm going to show you what my favorite source for that is, but look around, see who's funding other organizations in your field that might have an interest in funding yours. And then also, there is a number of online grant resources that you can utilize, either by subscription or you can just pay for a list of other grants that are available out there. And I'm going to dig into one of these. These are just some that I had heard of, and so I'm sure there's a million more, but I'm going to show you a couple examples in a minute. First, what to look for in your research. So there are lots and lots of foundations out there. So how do you know what to apply for? I will tell you, if you apply for a grant that you are not qualified for, or you ask for something that they don't fund, you're just going to annoy them. So you don't want to do that. Do your research, be thorough, understand what they fund, because it does not help you just to put an application in front of a foundation that doesn't meet their goals. It is better for you to be on point than to just throw something out there for the sake of throwing something out there. So first question, does the grantor's funding area match your mission and programming? Seems obvious, but that's important to know. What are their funding areas? And they will probably tell you. If it's not very clear on their website, you can probably get a call with one of their program officers, which is actually a good idea to do anyway, to find out what their funding areas are. Have they funded organizations similar to yours? That's going to give you a leg up. That's going to help you. Do they fund organizations in your geographic region? This is an issue with a lot of family foundations as well as corporate. There's a lot of banks that, like corporate foundations through banks, that will only fund projects in the regions that they serve. So be aware of that and know whether or not that company actually exists and considers your area a target area for them. What does it do and how much prep work is required? So I did mention there was a grant, this was a couple years ago, took me 2 solid weeks for a $5,000 grant. Now, depending on the size of your organization, $5,000 may or may not be meaningful. For the place that I was writing this grant for at the time, it was meaningful. But depending on how large your organization is, that much work might not be worth it for a very small grant. So think about that, manage your time, and be sure to put your efforts where it's going to be the most successful. And also, what is the typical reward? I just did a grant application where the cap was $7,500. Well, I don't want to be asking for $50,000 if the cap is $7,500. So be aware of what the typical award is, if there's any cap, because you want to show that you were fully prepared and aware of what that foundation is going to be willing to fund.
Barbara, we have a question for you.
Sure.
The question is about timing.
Sure.
Is a brand new startup likely to get funding through these traditional methods?
Good question. So if I was giving you my opinion, I would say no. I would say you're getting my opinion here. You're going to need to have some sort of track record. You're going to need to have something. If you are, for example, a brand new dance company and you've never done a performance, I think it's going to be much less likely for you to get any funding to stage something until you've got something to show for it. So I would say if you're a brand new startup, I would recommend other sources for funding than grants until you've got something that you can show. That's my opinion. I should also mention that in terms of, and I do another workshop like this with John where I talk about development 101, so kind of fundraising in general, not just grants. And I show the breakdown of where money comes from for nonprofits. Grants is a pretty small piece of that pie. You know, I think I'd be generous if I said it was 10% of the money that organizations typically get for fundraising. Most of the money that comes in for an organization in terms of contributed income comes from individuals. So if you are a brand new startup, I would start there. I would start with individuals that are interested in your mission, people who are on your board, Start there before you start seeking some grants.
I might add to that if I would, that
Please.
and Rondi and I find that the first time you apply for a grant or set a letter of inquiry, the funder is going to just not know who you are and read it, maybe be interested and put it aside. The next year, if you apply with a little bit more history and a little bit more to their guidelines perhaps, but you've got a second year on it, they actually might read it and think about it. Usually by the third year, they know who you are, particularly if you have been dripping on them for those 3 years about what you're doing and putting them on your mailing list and hopefully getting a meeting, and you'll have a much better chance. So it is not unusual at all to have to apply for something 3 times in order to finally get that grant. Doesn't mean you weren't as qualified as the very first year. And often as well, and I believe the city arts grants are like this, you have to be a nonprofit for a year before you are allowed to apply. They need to see a track record.
Yes, agreed. And by the way, I mean, this isn't the topic of today's presentation, but corporate sponsorships works the same way. Very, 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 very rarely does a corporation fund you the first go round. I mean, it is not likely to get a sponsorship if you are brand new. So it is worth it. Put your stuff out there, do it over and over, but know that it's going to take a while to get enough traction. Good question. That was my professional advice. All right. Let's talk about Foundation Directory online. This is a great service from the Foundation Center for searching for grants. You can put in very specific parameters of what you're looking for in geographic area, and it will spit back out at you a variety of grants. Now, it's not necessarily going to filter it for you to let you know if it's a good fit or not, or whether or not you are likely to get funding from them, but it provides a lot of great leads. And so if you typed in, let's say you're a theater company, type in theater, type in Tampa Bay, and there might be 20 foundations that come back at you, I would use that as a lead list and go from there in order to try to identify if any of those are actually viable options. Another one that I really like that I used to use a lot when I was at American Stage, and then a little bit after that, is the Chronicle of Philanthropy has a listing of everyone who has gotten grants. They're letting you know who has recently gotten an award. I find this useful and interesting because it shows me other companies that are similar to my own that got funding successfully. And so that sometimes gives you some breadcrumbs and some hints as to foundations you could apply for also and the types of things that they like to fund. All right, let's talk a little bit about gaining insight about a potential funder. Let's say you go on Foundation Center, it spits back out at you 20 different foundations that it suggests you might want to apply for. So here are some things that you might want to do before you invest a whole lot of time into doing that application. The first is to learn about past award winners. Be aware of how much they asked for, what was funded, and what the experience was like. So then you can try to figure out if your project has a similar affinity to that foundation. You could also talk to others who have applied for that to see if it's going to be a good option for you. I'll use the example of Bank of America Neighborhood Builder Award. When I worked at American Stage, we got that big award, and I did hear from people years after asking me what that experience was like so then they could plan ahead for themselves. So that was good research on their part. A lot of times, the foundations will meet with you. They'll meet with you as a program officer. They're not going to meet with you the week before the grant is due, but they'll meet with you 6 months out if you show really good planfulness to talk about what are the funding priorities of this particular foundation and how do you fit in. There's one that we apply for every year through the orchestra that has a new president and CEO. And so we use that opportunity to get to know that person in order to find out what the funding priorities are and what the interests might be. Attend a grant workshop if offered. So the state of Florida right now is running a bunch of different grant workshops, and a lot of them do, that basically just tell you, how do you apply? This workshop you're going to right now is pretty general. I'm trying to make it applicable to almost anything, but a lot of the larger grants will have something specific that you can attend in order to give you hints. It's sort of like going to a study session before an exam. It's a way for you to be prepared as to what they're going to be asking for and how you can be successful. Also, importantly, and Wayne reminded me this the other day, read past grants that were awarded or scored well. You can go over to the city office, I mean, maybe not right now, but generally, and you can look at past grants that did really well. I used to go in and read the top 1 or 2 grants because I was curious. You know, what was it about those applications that were so good? And a lot of times, good panelists, I mean, I always do, I always put lots of comments on my score sheets. And so that's a good way for you to get insight as to what grant scorers are looking for on the applications. All right, before I get into writing a proposal, anything else any of the other panelists want to throw in? I love seeing you. It's nice to see you there. All right, let's talk about writing a proposal. Great. Qualities of a strong proposal. So this is true in many aspects of your life. Your proposal should be all of these things. It should be compelling. It should be not boring, should I say. It should be a good read. It should be interesting, to the point, convincing, compelling. Also, appealing looking. So it's, if possible, some of the grants will let you throw in visuals or use bullet points, something that's going to make it look like anything other than a wall of text. You want it to be very readable. Appropriate. We talked a little bit about this earlier, that you want to make sure that your application is meeting the funding needs of whoever you are asking for money from. Also, please be organized. Yes, a lot of times grant proposals are a bit repetitive. They tend to ask the same question over and over. This is your opportunity not to just repeat yourself, but to throw in additional information and make sure that it flows. Make sure it all reads really well. Be focused, and please, please, please be free of errors. I say this a little bit in one of the slides that's coming up, but invest enough time in this situation to get a proofreader, somebody on your board, a friend, anyone, to look over it and make sure that it is right. I am not the best typist, FYI. I know this about myself, and I know that I can have spelling errors in things that I write. And so I do try to build in some time to have somebody look over that, because I know that that is a personal issue. Anyone who's on this call who's ever worked with me probably knows that that's true. All right, let's talk a little bit more about qualities of a strong proposal. All right. Actually, John Collins asked me to throw this in, and I agree. Show a sense of worthiness and confidence without being entitled. There's a difference. There's a fine line. You want to demonstrate expertise in your field, but that needs to be founded. You can't just say, we are the best theater company in the state of Florida, if you don't have anything to back that up. You want to show expertise without showing entitlement. You can also include qualifications of your project leaders. A lot of times grants will ask for that. They want to know the bios and the background of the people they're going to be leading your project, because they want to make sure that they're putting their money into an organization that can follow through and show that you will deliver on what is promised. This goes to the track record question before. You want to make sure that they know that if they're going to be putting money into this, it's going to be worthwhile. Be clear and to the point. It's better to make it shorter and compelling and interesting than super long and boring. So be clear and to the point, and watch your character limits. You're just going to annoy your reader if you go over the limit that they're asking. If they want 100 characters, give them 100 characters. Oh, and I said this already. It's better to submit something short and compelling than to fill the space with blah. Plan ahead. As I mentioned before, recruit a proofreader. Also, this is oftentimes a problem. Gather your needed attachments well in advance. All right, I am going to admit I had a situation a couple weeks ago that I did not do this. I did not carefully enough read all of the things that were required within a grant, and I had to include a letter of support from another organization. Now, a letter of support is not something you can wave a magic wand and get. It requires me asking someone to please write this letter for us, and so then I could submit it in order to show that we had a legitimate partnership. I did not plan ahead, and it required some scrambling on the part of someone who I think is on this call today, and I apologize. So learn from my mistake. Do not make your colleagues scramble, because that will just annoy them. Try to plan ahead, know what the attachments are, and don't wait until the week before in order to gather these things, because sometimes it's not going to happen. Know your funder. We talked about this a little bit before with research. Don't waste your time or theirs by applying for something that you are just not going to get. ROI is important too. Demonstrating that you are going to be using their money well. You are a good steward of the money that they're going to give you. If they've got a stack of proposals in front of them, they're going to pick the one that is going to give them the best return on their investment in the community. And importantly, tell a great story. Understanding your project is going to be very compelling to your reader. If you can, throw in some visual elements. For example, we do a lot of fun at Florida Orchestra. We apply for a lot of grants for our youth concerts. Saying how great our youth concerts are is one thing, including a letter from a student with a picture that they drew of the orchestra and saying the music was so beautiful it made me cry. I had never seen an orchestra before. I love music. It made me feel happy. All those things. That is going to be so much more interesting, compelling, and tell the story more than just me trying to say how great we are. Let your results speak for themselves also. If you're reaching 26,000 school students every year, then let that speak for itself. And finally, this is a plea. This is a plea on my behalf and on behalf of all of your grant readers everywhere. Be kind to your grant reader. Sometimes it feels like we are drowning in all of this paperwork, so please make our lives easier the following ways. Answer the questions. Please answer the questions. If you're not sure if you've answered the question, go back and read the question and make sure you have answered the question. I went to a workshop last week for the state of Florida and I got a little tip, which was, if necessary, restate the question within your answer in order to make sure that you have answered the question. You don't want to just throw words up there that don't have anything to do with the question. And I can't tell you how many times this happens, that I read the answer and I say, that's nice, but that's not what we asked. It doesn't fit. Don't make us hunt down information. I have an issue with this, especially when I'm reading grants for the state, because I don't know every arts organization in the state. In the city of St. Pete, I probably do, but you shouldn't assume that. Don't assume that your grant reader already knows you and already loves you. That application needs to stand alone. Don't make us hunt for information. I read a grant application 2 years ago for the state, and I read the whole thing, and at the end I said, I still don't get what they do. What is this? So I had to go to their website in order to figure out what they even did. And that, don't let that happen. That's not good, because your grant application really should stand on its own. Oh, what I just said. Grant proposals should stand alone. Don't count on your reputation for a great grant score. I've seen this happen. I've seen panelists that get up there and wax poetic about why they love that organization so much because of their personal relationship with it. And if you ever sat in one of those meetings that I was chairing for the city when we were scoring those grants, you know that I cut people off when they do that, because it is not about the personal relationship of the grant reader that's going to get you a good score. It's going to be about the quality of what you put out there. Also, be aware that your grant reader might not be from your industry. I see this especially on the state level, that they might be pulling in people from other industries that don't know what an SPT theater is, for example. And so, or what an SPT contract is, or what a LORT theater is. Don't assume that whoever is reading your grant is very familiar with your industry-specific lingo. So if you're going to use an acronym, you need to explain what it is. In fact, I actually won't read grants for the state that are within the same category as the organization that I'm working for, just because I feel like I need to be more neutral than that. So I'm not going to know. If I'm reading something, especially from an art museum, I don't have a visual art background. And so don't use a lot of acronyms that are just going to confuse people. All right, I'm going to get into evaluation. But before I do that, I'm going to just pause for a second. Everybody good?
I would add one thing to your
Sure,
presentation about writing letters of reference for people writing grants. I probably got my 6th one just 3 days ago on Friday, saying they needed it over the weekend, and would I write it and talk about what a great organization they are. I'm like, well, who do I send it to? Oh, it's just over there at the such and such corporation. Well, I happen to know those people. I could write to a person for them. I could put, dear Miss So-and-so, and I could write it more particular. And my second question was, why don't you write me a paragraph about what you're applying for, so that then I know how to better promote you. And it was, oh, well, we're kind of not really sure yet what we're asking for. We're working on it this weekend. So what can you imagine when the person reads my letter to them and says, this is a great organization. I don't know what they're applying for, and I don't even know to whom it may concern. to me, is the mark of death. If you haven't taken the time to learn who you're applying to and the name of that person and try to develop a relationship, you're shooting yourself in the foot. That's all I wanted to add.
Thank you. Agreed. Speaking of shooting yourself in the foot, let's talk about program evaluation. All right. Most foundations are going to want to know, what are your measures of success? How are you going to know that whatever program that they funded actually worked? How are you going to know this? And the only way to know this is to have a plan. So before you embark on your project, you or whoever you work with, the collective you, should get together and talk about what your evaluation methods are. What are you going to be looking at? Here are some sample things that I tend to use. Attendance figures is pretty obvious. Budget analysis, was it successful because you stayed within budget? Are you going to be passing out evaluation forms before or after the program to see how it went? Informal surveys are very nice. I love interviews, just like going around and asking, like this is especially nice with school kids to kind of go around and ask them their feedback and how they liked the program. My personal favorite, focus groups. I love focus groups because that helps you really narrow in on if your program is working and what it needs to accomplish. When you're planning your evaluation measures, be smart. What does that mean? Specific. Be specific about what you're going to be evaluating. Make sure that your measures are measurable. So then they're not just out there in the ether. It's something that you can actually track. Make sure it's attainable. This isn't just going to be something that you're going to hope for. You want to make sure you can actually get there. Realistic. Also, that R can stand for relevant. So realistic or relevant. You want to make sure that fits too. And time sensitive. It needs to be able to fit within the parameters of the evaluations that you're going to need to perform. Here are some tips on evaluation. Gather and study statistics before your project begins, so then you have some sort of meaningful benchmark. It's nice to say that your program made it possible for 10 kids to graduate successfully from high school. Well, would 10 kids have graduated successfully from high school anyway? What is the measure? What is the benchmark? Where did they start? What did your project do in order to affect that change? Have a plan. Have an execution plan before you begin the project. This is a problem a lot, is that I have to fill out all these grant reports, and I'm going to be talking about grant reports a little bit later. They want to know such specific information that we may or may not have remembered to collect as we've been going. And so know that ahead of time. And so then you can have a very organized plan before you begin in order to get what you need. Remember I mentioned focus groups. I do love focus groups. I love focus groups because it helps us make sure that we zeroed in on what needs to be done. Have your participants' location, schedule, and moderator in mind before you go into this project. All right, anything else about evaluation before I keep going?
Going back to my, what I mentioned, we have a question. You've all mentioned reference letters as well as accompanying documents from recipients of what you do as personal testimony for the program. If the materials are not requested, how do you know how much is enough versus how much is too much?
I don't think that there's any such thing as too much.
I said the same thing.
I'm going over in my head the 20 grant applications I've done in the last 6 months and trying to think if typically they limit it, not the other way. You can only submit 3 things, so I've got to find the best 3 things, as opposed to people complaining because I sent too much. If I send too much if they only request a certain number of things. Send as much as you can. There's really, push the limit. There is no way to overdo this. And send them frequent updates. And I'm going to talk about that later a little bit in terms of managing your award. Put them on your mailing list. Make sure they get all your e-newsletters. You can't flood them too much with information about what you do. If you annoy them, they'll tell you. But generally, I don't think you can overdo it. Okay. Budgets. Yay. Budgets. All right. Typically, with a grant application, you're going to need to submit 2 things. You're going to need your overall organizational budget, and then you're going to need the budget for the project itself. If you are just applying for general funding, this might be one and the same. But as I've mentioned a couple times, that I see less and less often. Typically, it's going to be the overall organizational budget and then a budget specifically for the project. So normally what happens is you're going to need to put numbers in for the most recently completed year as well as the current year. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit about that. That's my little COVID alert about projections for the upcoming year, and that'll be on the next slide. So just keep that little COVID alert in mind. All right, for your project specifically, first you need to know how much you're asking for, how much you are going to be putting towards the project. So a lot of times the foundations will require some sort of match. So if you're asking for, if the project, total cost of the project is $20,000, you're asking for 10, they're going to need you to pony up the other 10 and be able to show where that money's coming from because they don't want to be the only funder. So you're going to need to tell them what your additional sources of funding are, even if they're pending. Little note about COVID. This is our little friend COVID-19. So budgeting right now is all over the place. Everybody gets that. We know. What are we doing in the fall? Nobody knows. So it is all very up in the air. And so I got an alert recently from a foundation I was applying for saying, we get it. We know you don't know exactly what next year is going to look like. Give us a plan A, and then if things change, then you can give them a plan B as you go. What's important is to be transparent and to put out there that you're doing the best you can. And as things change, get out there and show them what has changed and what you're going to be doing. A little COVID alert. Hope everybody's safe and happy right now. All right, a couple more things about the project budget. First is to be aware of allowable costs. I was just looking over the city grant application, and there are certain things they'll fund and there's certain things that they won't. So you need to be aware of that. For example, a lot of foundations won't fund travel, for example. So like if you're applying for professional development, they won't fund the travel costs that have to do with that. Make sure that you are within what is allowable, or as I mentioned before, you're just gonna annoy your funder. As I mentioned earlier, also many grants require matching funds and lists of additional funders, so you need to be prepared to provide that information. And be realistic about your expenditures. You don't want to just make up stuff, but if you do have to estimate, if you're going to be varying greatly from that, it is better to tell the foundation at the outset so then they're aware that that is going to be happening. All right, manage your award. Yay, great news, you got a grant. Woo, woo, exciting, that's awesome. Okay, now what? Now what do? You got the grant, that's really good news. So what happens? A lot of things. First off, what do they need from you? Do they require some sort of signed agreement? Usually, there's something you have to sign, something that you have to submit. Is it for operational expenses or a specific project? If it's for a specific project, you have to use it for the specific project. That's how that works. And so be aware of that. And know what that money's for and make sure you've got good internal communication so that money is used properly. What recognition are you expected to provide? This is really important because it's all over the map. There are foundations that require that their logo be on every single thing that ever exists. There are foundations that prefer to be anonymous. So know what they want. Make sure that you're aware. If they want their logo on stuff, ask for a proper format of their logo. If they only need to be on certain things, then be aware of that too. You are probably going to have to submit some of those materials as a follow-up report. And so if they are expecting their logo to be on everything, you're going to need to show them that their logo was on everything. So be aware of that and have some sort of system to track what their expectations are and how you're going to meet them. How do you receive payment? Sometimes the foundation just sends you a check. Yay! Sometimes you have to submit an invoice to them. Sometimes you have to spend the money first and then they reimburse you for it. So know what it is, and so then you can be sure to get your money when you expect to get it. What progress reports are you expected to provide? So some grants will require you to fill out something very specific in a specific amount of time. However, if it's not required, as I was saying before about keep in touch with your funders, flood them with information, stick them on your mailing list, make sure they're getting your season brochure and updates, and so then they know what they're putting their money into and they don't forget you, because you're probably going to have to apply again next year. Speaking of which, reports. Let's talk about grant reporting. So most of the time, if you get some sort of foundation grant, you're going to need to provide some sort of report at the end. to tell how those funds were used and to make sure that the purpose of the report or the purpose of the grant was met. So be aware of those deadlines. A lot of them will send you reminders, which is helpful, but just in case they don't, hopefully you have some sort of CRM system in order to help you keep up with when those reports are due. Here's a for instance, Division of Cultural Affairs, Culture Build Florida. So they have various grant forms and documents that you can go visit their website in order to see what you've got due and when. I believe we got a notice yesterday, in fact, from the state of Florida, letting us know when we're going to be doing our end of year grant wrap-up report, which by the way is simultaneous with the application for the following year. Here's just one that's mine that I threw up here just kind of as an example. Jessie Bell DuPont Fund, they have very, very, very specific reporting needs and deadlines. Often, there's a lot of them. And so stay on top of those deadlines, fill out all the stuff that you need, and go from there. And keep in touch. Tell them all the awesome things you're doing. Tell them how great you are. Get them really into your mission. They believed in you enough to fund your project. And so hopefully you can grow and build that relationship over time in order to hopefully get funding again in the future. And then it all starts again. The cycle of life. Good news, this does get easier the more you do it. But once that grant is done, it is about time to get started on that process again. All right, this is what we covered in the last, how long has it been? Hour? My goodness, that went quickly. So this is an overview of everything that we went over. I'm happy to take questions if you have any. Here is my slide that indicates questions. Questions?
While we're perhaps waiting for, While we're perhaps waiting for questions to come in, I would add that a lot of this is applicable to the city's arts grant program, and also to those who may not be applying from the arts world. The city has a neighborhood arts grants program. I think there's $500 grants, and the city has neighborhood matching programs, which Kenwood got last year before I think it was $20,000 to do art in their neighborhood. So definitely look at the other options there. We also have emailed you, and can email you again if you'd like it, a copy of the city's arts grant program, but also the attachment, and they're also on our website, of I think there's 70 different places that artists can apply for awards, or nonprofit arts organizations can apply for grants. And there's also resources in there like summers away at workshops. So definitely take a look at that, and obviously all of these things would apply to that as well. Wayne's here. Is there anything from the city side, and you're on mute, I see. Is there anything from your office you'd like to speak to?
No, thanks, John. I will say this, though, that if anybody's got any questions about any of the city grants, we're more than happy to arrange a Zoom meeting with any organization and talk about the grants and help them in any way we can. They just need to email us or give us a call on one of our cell phones, and we'll set that up. So we're here to be of service and be of help. And again, our grant, as Barbara had mentioned, is almost identical to the state grant. So if you do the city grant, you should be doing a state grant if you qualify for that too. But we're here to help.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Wayne. Barbara, we also have another question about how would you use data in your impact statement?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I would use it in order to build your credibility, to show why your organization is worthy to get additional funding because of the data that you have, the track record that you've demonstrated, the programming that you've done. That's what I would use. Even better if your data can show some sort of growth. To say, you know, we piloted this program and reached 100 kids. By the second year, we reached 200 kids. By 2025, we're aiming to reach 1,000 kids or something. Anything that's going to show planfulness, additiveness, and a larger impact.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Last call for any questions. There is one overview question of, can we get copies of this? And I would close with, This is being recorded, including what you're seeing on the slides, and we can email, and we will also put it on Facebook. And we'll get the word out. Once Zoom has finished recording this in the cloud, we'll give you the URL so that you can watch that yourself and catch the whole thing if you had to come in late. Now that I've said that, 2 more questions came in. I haven't had to work on a grant proposal yet, but I'm working on a conference proposal right now, and a lot of this information, oh, so much for the question. She appreciates you taking all the time to do this, so thank you, Barbara.
My pleasure. Happy to.
And another one is, are tables and diagrams more useful in presentation than numbers or text? Example, couched in paragraphs.
Yes, well, I think so. I mean, it depends on the grant. So in ancient times, in the olden days, when I first started doing grants, they were all paper. We were literally submitting something. And so that was actually one of my personal goals when I became chair of Arts Advisory, was to get all of the grants electronic, because we used to have these huge, heavy bins of all the grants that we had to carry around. It's harder now because everything is electronic to be able to throw in a lot of visuals, but there's always a way. So I personally think so. In presentations I do, like right after this, I actually have a board meeting right after this, and my presentation to the board mixes between a lot of visuals like charts and diagrams and text. And so, I mean, that's not really a grant question, that's like a presentation question, but yeah, I mean, I'm a visual learner just personally, and so I find that more useful. That's why I throw a lot of little pictures and things into my slides. But yeah, if you're making a case for support, I think as much visual as you can add in is only going to help you.
Another question, one we've all had to deal with, for grantors wanting to know who other project funders are. How do you answer this if you don't know yet?
Yes, we have all been there. So it's, what I typically do is note if something's tentative. For example, if I'm applying for a project and I've got 6 other applications out there, I'll mark them as tentative. And so it at least shows an effort, at least shows that I'm trying to get the funding. And then if it's gonna be private support, like this happens at the orchestra a lot, that we'll have a project that we're gonna do it whether we get the grant or not, because it's baked into our regular budget. And so we're gonna cover the cost of that through private donations if we don't end up getting the grant. So you can indicate that too. You don't have to list the names. You can just say private funding and a certain amount on that too. But yeah, I mean, that's gonna happen. That's typical.
Yeah, I would add, we often see that they will say, who else are you applying to?
Mm-hmm.
And even if they're not asking that, you could put that in there as in a way of answering this question.
Mm-hmm.
Another question is, any recommendations on finding individual sponsorship for emerging companies or artists with no previous track record or funding?
Yeah, it's, yeah, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, one of those questions, it's individual funders is gonna be your first stop. And I think 80% of funding comes from individuals, I think. I mean, the number goes back and forth, but you get the point. So yes, networking, it's all about networking. It's about finding out who might have some sort of interest in the thing that you're doing. And the best source of that information is your board. So we are nonprofit people, we work for a board. And so the board are the ones that drive the mission in the organization. They should be using their personal contacts in order to help further your mission. Otherwise, they shouldn't be on your board. That's another workshop, by the way, about board governance that both John and I have done. So if you ever need that, let us know. But that's the first place to start, is some sort of proven interest. You know, what I tend to do if I have a project and I know that it's, let's say that it has to do with music lessons for underprivileged kids in a specific area, what I start with is people that either I've heard of or I'm aware of them funding something either in the similar area or a similar type of program. So that's a good start. This is just sort of fundraising 101. You're going to get a lot more no's than you're going to get yeses, but any type of networking that you can do in order to get the word out about your project is going to help connect you with funders that might be interested.
I would add to that, look to like whatever events you're looking for or whatever you're looking for sponsorship for. as Barbara said earlier, every one of us goes out to American Stage or the orchestra, and the first thing we do is turn to the back of the program and see who gave them money. Who are their sponsors? Who are their advertisers? We all know it. We all do it. We look at the back of the alumni magazine and see who has a great job and is the president of a corporation that we can call up and ask for. So the research is very important, and then the networking. It just goes back to who knows who.
Yeah. You know, I also want to use something interesting I learned from a Foundation for Healthy St. Petersburg. I've been to a number of programs there, and they've all been really interesting. And whoever was speaking, maybe Randy Russell or someone was saying how there was one grant cycle where they had 20 different organizations all apply for the same thing. Like 20 different groups were all meeting the same need within the community. And what they looked at that and recommended is that those 20 organizations work together. Instead of a little funding for all 20, if you all will collaborate, you would be able to address the problem more specifically. I use that as an example because if you're a brand new startup, really know the need that you are serving within the community, because it's possible that that need has already been met, in which case you could join forces with that existing organization and help them have more impact as opposed to splitting. So I get asked a lot. I mean, as you can imagine, I get asked a lot opinions on raising money for new nonprofit organizations or for startups. Most of the nonprofit organizations in Pinellas County are very, very small. And by small, I mean annual budget of less than 100,000, maybe not even any hired staff. And a lot of them are serving the same needs. And so before you go start a new company, make sure that there's a need for it.
Do you have any recommendations for good resources for beginning stages of a 501c3?
Oh, yeah. I've started a few. Let me think what to point you to. There's great resources online, I gotta tell you. I mean, I wish I had a better answer, but you know, I helped a 501c3 startup a couple years ago, and it was really just paperwork. It's going online and getting all the papers that you need in order to start it. That's not the hard part. The hard part is understanding the need that you're gonna be serving, and just like I was saying, making sure that that need isn't already met. I was in a conversation once about someone talking about I really want to start a nonprofit to address kids in the foster system. And I kind of said to him, you're not the only one to ever go there. There's probably something that already exists. And so do your research, try to figure out who's already meeting that need and then support that as opposed to trying to split it.
And at the risk of sounding a little self-important, definitely check out what's going on at the greenhouse with the classes and the sessions that the Arts Alliance is teaching there. It's what Barbara's been doing for several years, as well as other courses that are offered there that we're offering. There are others, the Nonprofit Resource Center offers them. There's several things online that you can look up. Board Resource Center. It's not much to be a member, and they offer a lot on how to work with your board, which is probably one of the first things a new 501c3 needs to learn how to do, because your board is your backbone.
Yes. Amen.
Amen.
Yes, and if you need me to come in and work with your board, let me know. Alrighty, well, this is always fun.
It's a good time to wrap up.
Good time to wrap up. All right, everybody. Well, I enjoyed revisiting these slides and looking at all of this again and seeing the lovely faces of the other hosts of this meeting. So thank you. Thank you for inviting me, and good luck.
Thank you, Barbara. We're getting lots of thank yous on the chat line too. Bye-bye, everyone.
My pleasure. Bye.